How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to WWII Hobby Time. I saw this box of soldiers at my local hobby store the other day, and I was struck with inspiration to build a diorama of a giant snake. I'm not sure why, that's just how it is. After everything was out of the bags, I snapped them from their sprue trees, and it was time for assembly. The minis required a little more cleanup than Tamiya figures of the same scale, but even so, they were straightforward and easy to assemble. After the body parts were all together, I added some guns, and a few of the guns required straps which were not included in the kit, so I had to make my own. I made the straps using a thin rod of styrene that I squeezed between some pliers to get nice and flat. I then cut it to length and I glued it to all of the guns that needed straps, but were still strapless. The box may not have included any straps, but it did come with a bunch of extra bits that I will not be needing for this build, so I threw those all in my bits box, and that was the assembly complete. I stuck all the minis on a painting handle, and once their feet were glued, I set them aside to begin working on the terrain. For the terrain, I started with a sheet of MDF and I cut it using a straight edge and a nice sharp knife. Even though the knife was very sharp, I had to make multiple passes to get all the way through the board. Eventually, I did get all the way through the board, so I grabbed a piece of XPS foam. I used another sharp knife with a longer blade to slice the foam to the size of the MDF, and then I glued the pieces together using some foam-safe superglue. And I used a spray-on accelerator from Superglue Man to accelerate. After that, I began slicing up what will be the bottom of a swampy wetland somewhere in the South Pacific, or maybe deep in the heart of the Congo during World War II. Not exactly sure where the location of this diorama is supposed to be set, but it's definitely somewhere with massive snakes. I used a torch to soften and even out the edges of the foam, and then it was time to mix up some Sculpt Demold to give the bed its surface. I threw a couple handfuls of the dry ingredients into a cup with a few squirts of the wet ingredients, and I mixed them thoroughly by hand. Once thoroughly mixed, I smeared the paste across the surface of the foam until the whole thing was covered, and then I used some isopropyl alcohol to smooth it out. While it was still wet, I stuck some broken tree stumps from Woodland Scenics into the foam. The goal was to kind of create a ghost forest on the edge of a wetland that had seen some severe weather over the years. Once the ground had been covered in trees, I set the base aside to dry and I moved back to the minis. And while I paint these guys, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. After priming the figures black, I switched to a dark brown for the boots, followed by multiple layers of camo greens, moving brighter and warmer as I got closer to the top of the minis. Once the little green army men had a nice subtle gradient from top to bottom, I swapped to a brush and began painting all the non-green details like skin, weapons, and straps. Unfortunately, this little squad got separated from their platoon during a big storm, and now they're trying to find their way back to camp, taking what appears to be a shortcut through a swamp. Unfortunately, no one gave them the memo that there may be giant snakes in the swamp. I finished up the painting by giving the top edge of everything a little highlight, followed by a dark brown enamel pen wash, which helped give the recesses and the bottom of the rain covers a little more contrast. At this point, the base was nice and dry, so it was time to make a snake. A few months ago, I made another large snake, which I intended to be an anaconda, but apparently it looked more like a python. This time around, I'm making a python, but I'm not going to call it a python, because it probably looks like something else. So this time around, I'm just going to call it a giant snake. Sculpting snakes is fun and easy. All you have to do is roll up a log of clay, make it a bit curvy, and then poke some holes for the eyes and the nostrils, and you're pretty much good to go. But just don't call it an anaconda. And for a little extra snaky detail, you can push a mesh over your clay to create a nice scaly texture. That's what you see me doing here. It's hard to see the scales on camera, but trust me, they're there. Now that I'm thinking about it, it won't really matter because they won't be visible under the water anyways. I then gently pressed the snake's head onto its body and I took it to the oven where I baked it. And when it was done, it was still hot and soft, and I brought it back and pressed it into the base to match the contour of the terrain, and I only burned my fingers a little bit. Once the snake had cooled, it was time to paint again. I primed the base and the snake black, and then layered up the earthy colors of the mud that you'd see somewhere in the South Pacific or the Congo during World War II. I was genuinely curious why I thought to make a giant snake diorama when I saw these World War II soldiers at the hobby store, so I searched my memory to figure it out. And I remember hearing about a story from World War II where a pilot was flying over some jungle area and he saw a huge snake out the window. I'm not sure if that story is legit or not, but I think that's what subconsciously made me think giant snake when I saw these World War II soldiers. After the ground and the snake were both done, I touched up the broken trees with some highlights and the painting was done. After that, it was time to put my soldiers in place. After the soldiers were in place, and in order to protect the paint from seeping into the coming resin, I took it outside and I applied a clear coat of matte varnish. And once the clear coat had dried, I got the base ready to pour my resin. I used some silicone adhesive to glue some strips of acrylic to the sides of the diorama to make a dam that will hold back the resin water. Once all 4 walls were in place, I sealed up the corners with a bead of silicone and I cleaned up the silicone tube, and I left the whole thing to dry for 24 hours. 24 hours later, I came back to it, the silicone was fully cured, and it was time to pour the resin. I measured out equal parts resin and hardener, and I dyed it the color of swamp water, like you'd see somewhere in the South Pacific or the Congo during World War II. After the pigments had been added to the hardener, I combined the hardener with the epoxy and mixed them thoroughly, and it was time to pour my water. After all of the resin was in the mold, I tended to the surface, popping the bubbles with a butane torch and a light misting of isopropyl alcohol, and then I had to wait for it to cure. 36 hours later, the resin was cured and ready to demold. Unfortunately, some of the foam stuck to the acrylic and got peeled away with it, but fortunately we can hide those imperfections with some wood veneer. I wanted to try adding some raindrop effects to the surface of the water using gloss Mod Podge and some straws. I've seen other scale modelers use this technique, and it looked way better when they did it, but that's okay because my plan all along was to riddle the surface of the water with pond scum or duckweed, hiding the poorly executed rain effects. Light green paint and a needle nose applicator is a secret weapon for making convincing swamp water. The second to last step was to hide the uneven edges of the foam with some wooden veneer, and the last step was to paint those sides with black 4.0. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.